Elizabeth Salafia said hi. Little Pumpkin Goober said hi. Simon Steele a Brainrot fan says, hi. Simon Steele a Brainrot fan says, it's C. Anish Lovo says, double tap on your screen, face red heart shape.
at airplane subscribed.
À, à, học aku berkunjung. Hmm. 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 Oh, gitu. Hmm. 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 Oh, gitu.
J0HNNYF1V3 says, C is the female, it's always the hips. J0HNNYF1V3 says, C. Sudhakar says, C1 is correct. Leon Garrett says, said hi. Pleisteroshatat says, all three are women. Jovi Malone says, AA. Stephanie Easman I9F says, all three of them. MB8F6N says, HM. Sarah Clarkistwart says, AAA. Stephanie Easman I9F says, them asterisk. Loading Q69 says, I love you Sari. Yaya Hassan 0 says, I love you Sari. Midnight KO says, C could be, hips look wider but cervix looks like male. Confused. Yaya Hassan 0 says, haha cool. Brooklyn T6G9I says, help. Brooklyn T6G9I says, they are the same. Yaya Hassan 0 says, Yehya is smart. Vania Garcia says, HI. Vania Garcia says, Vania Smart, 3. Matthew Crowley says, see, they have a wider pelvis. Kostub Hod F6Y7C says, oh. Yaya Hassan 0 says, Yehya is handsome. Kostub Hod F6Y7C says, said hi. Vania Garcia says, no lie. Vania Garcia says, cap. Yaya Hassan 0 says, Yehya is handsome. Vania Garcia says, cap. Yaya Hassan 0 says, Yehya is super handsome and smart. Dragon Sister says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Dragon Sisters 647 welcome. Felt Frog says, they're all male. Wit K8H says, C because the pelvis. Matthew Crowley says, C is female. Certified Baller 69 says, I like dinosaurs. Yaya Hassan 0 says, Yehya knows everything. Felt Frog says, it's the same pelvis on all of them. Watermelon Girl Watermelon says, hello. Bot says, welcome to chat at watermelongirl.watermelon welcome. Jen Nelson 92 says, 67. Jen Nelson 92 says, 67. The Stoikman ZZZ says, the one who stopped talking last. Morpheus Fireborn says, see, pelvis is wider. There would be more differences but the skeleton has been altered just enough to be confusing from the lack of extra rib. Certified Baller 69 says, meow. Nick Hosford says, they're all male. EWBR00 says, so it's C. Yahya Hassan 0 says, Yahya is smart, Yahya is handsome, Yahya is cool, Yahya knows everything, Yahya created Mars, Yahya has a rocket. Grace Brunkefan Mimic M1 Ton says, it's C. Alan Valverde Z9Y says, is he just gonna ignore me? 82 Hadesa says, the one. Persecuted Forchrist says, am I right? Albert Fan CL says, I need the AI to notice me, yo. Thestoikman ZZZ says, who cares, she dead. Certified Baller 69 says, oh say, can you see by the dawn's early light? Billy Ackver says, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. Lexm says, we hear you. 82 Hadesa says, the skeleton if it has one rib less from the others too. Midnight Chaos says, not same pictures. C has 1 mm extra on pelvis and the cervix as well. Brantley KX8Q says, Epstein. Billy Ackver says, I poo my pants. Umama Hezwareya Hamadi says, ABC. Lexm says, all skeletons are the same. Persecuted Forchrist says, I changed my mind. I think it's A. Stephgoat RL and it says, Nat Z. July Erazo says, ah dang it. Jen Nelson 92 says, the first time the team had played together was the first game in which they played. Tempest Slayer 12 says, C feels like it's smaller and thinner than the others, so it might be C. Lyrish Paul says, Fa. Illinois Rail Fan says, Nah. Jen Nelson 92 says, the first time the team had played together was the first game in which they played. Keegan Eichert 12 says, I say it's B. Ibrahim 97 GT says, give option A and B only. Keegan Eichert 12 says, said hi. Garth Klaus says, your mom. Caden Shirkus says, it's C because the hips are wider. Ever C7R says, I don't know. Swaysforlive says, C cause of the wider pelvis I guess. Chris Infan says, I think C. Midnight Chaos says, C is a woman with a small pelvis. Ethan Bolton says, C is the one because the pelvis is bigger than the other two. Elijah Pope 14 says, I don't really know, I just wanted to say this. Deku says, said hi. Emily Sanchez W7Q says, ick. Joseph Guerrero says, going for C, I have counted the bones and it's short by 2. Yakin S6C says, good game. Mia Alba E9N says, huh. Ibrahim 97 GT says, si Hosakta hi Anish. Maricel says, see because it has bigger hips. Texas Grillchef says, I had a computer do a check, all these skeletons are identical. Lexm says, how dare you skip me clanker. Yakin S6C says, FF. Midnight Chaos says, see, the pelvis is almost touching the arms. Tyson Trainline says, it is C because of the two abnormal bones below the pelvis. Yakin S6C says, Uchk. Yakin S6C says, Zuff. Emily Sanchez W7Q says, C. Yakin S6C says, H5HXYC. Zdren VR says, I hate neck hurts. Yakin S6C says, YCCHC. Howarayu62 says, it's C, and because the area for the reproductive organs needs to be bigger. Gman31 says, I think C also. Yakin S6C says, VJ. Stop Motion IDK says, it's C. Yakin S6C says, TC. Dark Core says, brew. Projection Experiment says, hello. Bot says, welcome to chat at Projection Experiment 769 welcome. Not S89GC89 says, trading base dragon. User S89GC. Foxy Waxalov Yippee says, C seems like the only right option. Braden Taylor G1U says, none they all got wings. Dark Core says, brew. Diego Sadegi says, see wider hips. Tia Blue the Gamer says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Tia Blue the Gamer welcome. Dark Core says, brew. Dark Core says, brew. Projection Experiment says, I just joined, how did I get VIP? I Love Sunset says, they are all men. Maybe. Broncos W says, I farted, it's a my fart set. Dark Core says, bro. Guiver says, saw. Projection Experiment says, hello. Bot says, welcome to chat at Projection Experiment 769 welcome. Fitzy Soda 11 says, it is C. Actual Fly 1 says, all. Father Gassy says, they're all the same. Donna Kidwell J7W says, I think it's A, B and C because they all look identical. Guiver says, wah. Mspolantina says, all. Yahya Hassan 0 says, Yahya is smart, 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 Yahya is smart. Yahya Hassan 0 says, Yahya is smart, 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 Yahya is smart. Mspolantina says, all BC they are all the same. Remington 150 Guy says, the primary distinguishing feature between male and female skeletons is the pelvis. A female pelvis is typically wider and shallower than a male's to facilitate childbirth, featuring a larger, more. Father Gassi says, AI. Super Evilary says, C. Mitchell Minor says, A and B are identical. C is different around the pelvis. C must be the woman. That is all from cross-die overlapping. John Terry X3D says, none of them they all have the same number of ribs. Kferi GT2JM says, yes, it's C. Projection Experiment says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Projection Experiment 769 welcome. Oliver Theig says, I duo SJK. Jace Martin VB30Q says, said hi. Oliver Theig says, it's C. Mint Lake 25 says, it's B. Feihehi says, said hi. Kferi GT2JM says, it is. Super Evilary says, see cause the hip is bigger I think I forgot what's the name. Space Rock says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Space Rock welcome. Flash J22 says, none. Projection Experiment says, I think C. John Terry X3D says, none of them they all have the same number of ribs. Projection Experiment says, face orange biting nails. Dear Mr. says, today is my friend Nick Gurr's birthday. Tell him happy birthday. Ofin the says, no. Jen Nelson 92 says, did you know that it is safer to play with pillows instead of playing with giant cylinder blocks on top of a 58-story tall building? Well, you learn something every day. Ofin the says, 1. Yurlo Kalpazaking says, yo what's up? Nitro Gerb says, it's same. Maddie and Jack says, everybody if you dislike I will send $1. Projection Experiment says, alright so as I have heard this turns out it's kinda delayed. Sarah Sabri N4Z says, poo poo woo ah ah ah. Ron Granscombe says, all three are women. Ian Dobbs P4W says, it's all of them. Crobert 10 says, look at the hips bottom. Mitty says, Gyps it is C, less broad-shouldered and the bottom of the hips is more thicker. Atlas Wilson 04V says, all of them. Bobby Lee says, they look like males to me. Yahya Hassan 0 says, Yahya is smart, 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 Yahya is smart. Yahya Hassan 0 says, Yahya is smart, 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 Yahya is smart. Michael Cueva says, C because of the bigger pelvis. Mohammed says, you chill. Demech says, neither, women have one more rib than men do and they all have the same amount. Icons for Life High says, hello. Bot says, welcome to chat at Icons for Life High welcome. Mohammed says, chill. ABG6Z4H1W says, bro they all same they're no pelvis. Atlas Wilson 04V says, it's C. Icons for Life High says, they are all the same. Jim Deckard RU2SJ says, pelvis and bone size this is invalid they are all the same. Mohammed says, what about me bro? Wellove Byler says, this is boring. Mohammed says, bro. Icons for Life High says, I subbed. Donovan Ivy says, ABC. Eric Hayes F4H says, all same. Gotcha Ninja 33 says, yo I can't see what is it. Dorcas Minazero U8L says. The 3ndless link says, hello. Bot says, welcome to chat at the 3ndless link welcome. Icons for Life High says, it's ABC. Jim Deckard RU2SJ says, and also they all have the amount of ribs. Boila Donatier says, hello fellow board people. Markiplier says, it's C bro. Ian Jack says, goon. Sophia Rainbow says, hi 67. Pork Chops and Gravy says, it's modern times. The woman is the one who believes it's a woman the most. Icons for Life High says, oh my god. Wellove Byler says, see. Jia Saved says, ye. 0000. Dasonfish says, hi. Wellove Byler says, is Slimer. Levic Duarte says, is it C? Dustin Borderland says, it's 3 men. Mr. at Cossaman says, none. Levic Duarte says, I think it's C. Jen Nelson 92 says, yeah. Who cares? Mr. at Cossaman says, no ni. Dustin Borderland says, it's 3 men, no women. Jen Nelson 92 says, me. Trendkill says, cat orange whistling. Rack 00N Guy Whitey says, it's C. My hero says, there's no difference, it's all of them. Prince Daryl Soso J5R says, we all know that we used the same method but there isn't. Dustin Borderland says, this is only men. Dustin Borderland says, no women. Projection Experiment says, I'm gonna play some music or watch something. Everybody have a good fantastic night. Clark Broderick S2J says, see they all look the same, but I'm picking C. Alyssa Rattel says, hi. Demitalo Ortiz says, Derry Cha is the one. Prince Daryl Soso J5R says, we all know we used the same method. Sevathy Self says, damn. Jesus 5925 a 6 says, said hi. Prince Daryl Soso J5R says, we all know we used all the same method in the up of leagues. Prince Daryl Soso J5R says, legs. Sevathy Self says, hello man. Baba Megumi R7G says, did he know? Samathegamer says, it's C. Prince Daryl Soso J5R says, we all know we used the same method in the up of the legs. Projection Experiment says, I don't hear anything anymore. Trendkill says, it's because women have smaller hip bones, the more you know. Striker Garland says, I eat skeletons. Prince Daryl Soso J5R says, we all know we used the same method in the up of the legs.
Subscribed.
Javier Corral says, the one who nags the most. Seraph Samwhat P2P says, I think number 3. Striker Garland says, I eat skeleton. Monch de Pell says, only man skeleton. Prince Daryl Soso J5R says, I can't find the balls. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, what the heck, I just joined, those were my first words. Taylor Robloxa says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Taylor_Robloxa, welcome. Prince Daryl Soso J5R says, I can't find the balls. William Kelly says, God bless you all, Jesus saves. Jen Nelson 92 says, 67. Anna O'Quinn D1Y says, bruh, it's C67. Seraph Samwat P2P says, I think number 3. Anna O'Quinn D1Y says, 6.7. Jen Nelson 92 says, there is no C. Bear Down says, 67. Yahya Hassan 0 says, Yahya is smart, 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 Yahya is smart. Anna O'Quinn D1Y says, 67676867. Striker Garland says, it's obviously D. Striker Garland says, no, it's D. Julia Kate says, hi, I'm at Julia Kate 689. Lily Evers H6T says, the only way I. Mick Didemilium says, Diddy. Mick Didemilium says, Diddy. All Time Tech 12 says, C because the pelvis is wider. Julia Kate says, it is C. Yahya Hassan 0 says, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. All Time Tech 12 says, it's C because the pelvis is wider. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, it's C, y'all look at the hips, it's larger than A and B. 1616XL8C says, can I get a shout out? Mick Didemilium says, Diddy Diddy. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, what do you mean no difference, look closely at the hip sizes. All Time Tech 12 says, it's C because the pelvis is wider. All Time Tech 12 says, it's obvious. Mimi Riley D2Y says, it's C because C has bigger hips bones because women have larger hip bones to give birth. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, GG58153 it's C, look at the hip size. Samithagomer says, said hi. GG says, it is a. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, woman hip bones are larger than a man's. Sabernaqueva says, said hi. All Time Tech 12 says, the answer is C because the pelvis is wider obviously. All Time Tech 12 says, it's the right answer. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, GG58153 it's not A, it's C. Wyaswentafrisweldon says, wait C. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, it's not B, it's C. Sabernaqueva says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Sabernaqueva 7446 welcome. Royalty Falconer says, hi. All-Time Tech 12 says, it's C because the pelvis is wider. Royalty Falconer says, what the heck? Goodbye Per Player says, Neo entendi nada KKA is okay KA 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 is o dixa EU ver. Bear Down says, Diddy knows. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, what do you mean smaller? Women have larger hip bones. Crystal Soultake says, for real. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, yeah, and Diddy says C. Eclass TM2 says, Mr. Pooper. Anna Shelton says, hello. Bot says, welcome to chat at Anna Shelton 9426 welcome. GG says, Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper how is it C? Red White Dot says, the man has a bone where you know you know. Crystal Soultake says, C because the skeleton has wider high. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, hip bones are larger than A and B, and woman hip bones are larger than a man's. Red White Dot says, 6-7. Crystal Soultake says, hip bones. All-Time Tech 12 says, the answer is C because of the wider pelvis. Butler says, none. Wolfamami says, all. Studio Fue Fue says, in the files there is a Talmud on display in the photos. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, I bet GG58153 doesn't even know what a pelvis is. GG says, can you give me a shout out please cause I subscribe and I have to go please. Pretty Savage F1H says, 67. Emmy Dando says, it's C. Eclass TM2 says, I heard brother's dogs barking in the background. GG says, actually, I do so you can't be talking. Claudine 69 says, ABC not maybe C because look at the bones. Samithagamer says, Sammy the Gamer is smart 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 Sammy the Gamer is smart. Red Spy the Dispenser Sapper says, then look at the pelvis on C, it's wider than A and B. Dan Butler 6D4 says, what is a woman? The Real Mandingo says, C but it's not accurate. Crystal Soultake says, I don't know to be honest. Falcon Peterbot FN says, 67. Sheila Corbett says, number C. Clarice Worsley says, can I get a shout out? Francisco Ayala Z3L says, letter C. GG says, can I get a shout out, please? Clarice Worsley says, hi bro, you are cool. The Real Mandingo says, der. Clarice Worsley says, C is woman BC it's Slimer. Idiot Puppy says, apparently there's a bone unique to gender but I can't find it. Non-Rev says, males can have childbearing hips too. Non-Rev says, but whatever. GG says, pelvis means it is a bony structure connecting to the spine to the legs located between the abdomen and thighs. Clarice Worsley says, hello bro. GG says, so you can't be talking. Dutch says, count the ribs. Men have 13. Women have 14. Idiot Puppy says, there's a bone that looks different depending on gender related to reproducing. Clarice Worsley says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Clarice Worsley 705 welcome. Pelias Marzan says, it's CCCCCCCCXCCVCC laughing out loud. Clarice Worsley says, hello. Bot says, welcome to chat at Clarice Worsley 705 welcome. Claudine Drebaldo 69 says, bro are you serious right now? Idiot Puppy says, why am I counting 10 ribs? Clarice Worsley says, MVP bro. Clarice Worsley says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Clarice Worsley 705 welcome. The Real Mandingo says, none of them you don't see my bone in them. Thelagullard says, y'all my fish barked at me help. James K8F1R says, see wide hip bone. Ilaviating Pizza says, BRO. Ilaviating Pizza says, now. Ilaviating Pizza says, NOO. Lemoy75 says, Pero si son identicos. Sean Sunny 6D3E says, oh no. Wint Production Channel says, hi bro. The Real Mandingo says, night bot but you let Claire spam. Journey IE8 says, it's hard. Bob Loves Burgers says, it's D. Unknown Spam says, said hi. Lemoy75 says, there is no woman, they are skeletons smiling. Journey IE8 says, I don't get it, what the heck. Unknown Spam says, I can't move on, baby doll waitin' on calls, flippin' through stations, KM outclassed and it's outrageous. Coda de Joya says, guys is C. K. Hapson says, middle. Wink Production Channel says, Tay. Journey IE8 says, ugh. Wink Production Channel says, no. Wink Production Channel says, no. The Real Mandingo says, where's my bone? SKZ Katsia Lover says, they all look the same. Coda de Joya says, ABCDFGHIJKLMNOPQRSTUVWXYZ. Minjascat says, shut up. Coda de Joya says, you shut up. Minjascat says, shup. Butter Farted says, C is female because of the hip bones being larger for the womb. Coda de Joya says, yes. Toru Oikawa says, none of them are women. They're all skeletons. Minjascat says, you shup up. Spaturo09 says, Dioscophosaporcoinfium. Stryabai says, yes. SKZ Katsia Lover says, oh wait, Butter Farted is right. Stryabai says, it's C. George Clay Q4N says, what? Butter Farted says, at Turo C is a female skeleton. Titus FG8I says, OM. Stryabai says, Scoriwiwi. The Real Mandingo says, where's my tip? Pixel Globetrot says, is C. Coda de Joya says, me yes. Pixel Globetrot says, say me, it is C. Journey IE8 says, okay it's C I guess. Faith Logston says, not every part of the skeleton is accurate. The pelvis is but the rest of the skeleton is not. Stryaby says hi. Butterfarted says, also females have smaller collarbones. The Real Mandingo says, it's a transformer. Minjascat says, Hisupamo Shupio. Ellis Eend Os A Kavanis says, see the hips are bigger. Stryaby says. Minjascat says, Hisupamo Shupio. Pixel Globetrot says, I'm getting out of here eat zucchini do you read me like the emoji I want you have you heard on the internet girl? Derek Keith says, those are all men. Women's pelvic bones are shaped like a heart. Stryaby says, no MJS kidding. Fizzy V1L says, see my science teacher say you can tell if it's a woman but I don't remember how laughing out loud. Ulzi says, what difference? Pixel Globetrot says, it could literally be any of them not all woman bones are the same, correct me if I'm wrong. FUC. 1MC0OLR1GHT says, touch my body tender cause the feeling makes me weak kicking off the covers I see the ceiling while you're looking down at me how can we go back to being friends when we just shared a bed, how can you look? Minjascat says Hisupamo Shupuyo. Martin Villa says, bruh. Stryaby says, hi I want you eat zucchini with a smile hee hee. Ayushi says, ah. Christina Takahashi R6F says, it's all of them it could be ABC. Stephanie Fuchs says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Stephanie Fuchs 3001 welcome. Random's Fandom says, what's a princess of friendship without her friends? Wachampion F9Y says, 6-7. Fizzy V1L says, why does it look like the skeleton's arms are combining? Minjascat says, ABC Donna Hisupamo Shupuyo. One MC0OLR1GHT says, rest in peace my granny she got hit by bazooka, yeah I think about her every time I hit the hookah, kaboom, kabeo, kaboom. Galabool68 says, see, 'cause look at the bone ahead of collarbone and beneath spinal cord, it's smaller. Kamanolo says, all three are male. Logan Shorter says, hello. Bot says, welcome to chat at Logan Shorter welcome. Mackenzie Montague says, it's obvc. Christina Takahashi R6F says, like bro it is all of them. Fizzy V1L says, my head hurts looking at this. Caleb Najra says, one on right is female. Wachampion F9Y says, people who say 67 are cornballs. Minjascat says, Hisupamo Shupuyo let it go BTS Dynamite smooth like butter like criminal undercover. Stryabai says, my name is ABI and it's for real C and Sue. Awi Abdul X1F says, it is none. Fizzy V1L says, cornballs imagine. Lucas Glitchfan says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Lucas_Glitchfan welcome. Best Beharaboy says, oh ma gaa. Dragons and Dandy World says, ITSC. Stryabai says, laughing out loud cornballs for Real. Caleb Najra says, C is female because of her wider hips. Awi Abdul X1F says, it is none of them. Fizzy V1L says, yeah I thought it is C but I'm not sure for good. Logan Shorter says, did you know Bruno Mars was not actually born on Mars? Lucas Glitchfan says, let the games begin. Tiny Noodle says, it's gotta be C. Tough Pigeon Mango says, let the mingos begin. Tough Pigeon Mango says, it's C. Stryabai says, what is this voice bro? The Real Mandingo says, blocked. Noah on pause Thurian says, I'm a Thurian. Fizzy V1L says, congratulations. Wachampion F9Y says, you are not tough bud. John Wyatt 04 says, these are the same skeleton. Not enough detail to determine sexual dimorphism in the drawings. Noah on pause Thurian says, I'm transgender. Quem official says, a pleepalepple. Christina Takahashi R6F says, you gotta make me freeze reasons that you gotta MH put her in Chanel MH put her in Chanel how you say you love me you ain't put me in Chanel you say you love me put her in Chanel. Caleb Najra says, it's in the hips. Tough Pigeon Mango says, shut the Noah. Martin Villa says, laughing out loud. Emma Newell says, see the pelvic is more wider. Quem official says, a pleepalepple. Martin Villa says, for real Noah. Logan Shorter says, did you know that if you eat a banana nothing will happen, it'll just give you nutrients? Noah on pause Therian says, hi, smiley face. Bot says, welcome to chat at Noah on pause Therian welcome. Martin Villa says, get yo out twin. Fizzy V1L says, pumpkin. Wachampion F9Y says, cornball. Fizzy V1L says, cronball again. Quem official says, it said my name right. Quem official says, woohoo. Wachampion F9Y says, you all cornballs. Fizzy V1L says, cornball asterisk. Kalabnajra says, when do we get the answer though? Quem official says, I am a stupid narrator AI. Fizzy V1L says, I'm not no cornball twin. Noah on pause Therian says, hi. Looking to welcome some autistic people, trans people, or Therians. Captain Joshua Aviation says, the right one bruh. Quem official says, what? Wachampion F9Y says, you sure? Quem official says, bro Futherians. Fizzy V1L says, yes I'm sure. Logan Shorter says, hee hee hair he. Captain Joshua Aviation says, the hips dog. Noah on pause Therian says, stop saying to Futherians, it's not funny or nice. Quem official says, RR. Wachampion F9Y says, alright. Quem official says, prove why being a Therian is better than being normal. Fizzy V1L says, don't be mean Quem official. Fizzy V1L says, there is no reason. Quem official says, I'm just asking to prove why it's better. Diru Mr. says, Hugh Janis and Mike Hawk. Noah on pause Therian says, it's not a choice to be a Therian, and being normal is actually just a dumb social construct and it should not control our lives. Quem official says, I bet the owner of this stream is just sitting back and watching the chat. Mel says, said hi. Fizzy V1L says, yes. Tom Bomb says, hi. Bot says, welcome to chat at Tom Bomb's welcome. Wachampion F9Y says, gang at Quem official is a big cornball. Noah on pause 3 says, is anybody else here weird? I like weird people. Fizzy V1L says, laughing out loud. Dearu Mr. says, Hugh Jerrickson. Quem Official says, yeah. Quem Official says, I'm weird ASF. Dearu Mr. says, okay Google. Mel says, C is a woman. Quem Official says, Hugh Janis. Quem Official says, Mycock. Fizzy V1L says, when did it get on that? Logan Shorter says, I bet Anish Lovo is just sitting back laughing at the comments. Ashley Curacao says, Isaac Hugh Janis. Noah on pause 3 says, honestly, the skeletons aren't different and biology is not gender anyway. Dearu Mr. says, Mike Latoris. Eva Heater says, okay. Quem Official says, that's what I just said buddy. Fizzy V1L says, hold on Imma test something out twin. Hawk ta I swear it's gonna sound so zesty if it say that. Quem Official says, it said it. Eva Heater says, C is a woman. Quem Official says, see if it says that. Arthur and Nadim says, see wider pelvis. Noah on pause 3 says, does anybody play Among Us here? Quem Official says, HAA. Ellie4 Ever 13 says, it's C because pelvis is wider. Quem Official says, my cock me cock me cock. Eva Heater says, T-sis awesome. Fizzy V1L says, my cock me cock me cock. Quem Official says, my cock my cock. Fizzy V1L says, it's so funny. Dearu Mr. says, Mike Hawk needs Hugh Janis. Quem Official says, my cock me cock me cock. Ayush Go LM5F says, CC. Clarity Dreams says, women's hips are naturally larger than men's, so I would pick C. Wachampion F9Y says, what? Game 4 Funtime says, TF. Eva Heater says, C have a shorter shoulder. Fizzy V1L says, no twin there is no TF. The 29 Bros W1Q says, Sofa King. Fizzy V1L says, it's so cold in my room that I'm freezing. Eva Heater says, A and B are male and C is a woman. Champion F9Y says, at Quem official is the biggest 5-year-old old if I ever seen one. Quem official says, Quem official says. Fizzy V1L says, goop. Quem official says, laughing my ass off. Quem official says, is that a compliment? Quem official says, I'm just messing around with the narrator. Champion F9Y says, damn no. Fizzy V1L says, I don't think so twin. Eva Heater says, this is educational. Quem official says, it's not every day you find a stream with a narrator like this. Quem official says, that hit deep. Fizzy V1L says, I know right. Quem official says, I thought we were cool man. Quem official says, didn't know you were like that. Fresty2 says, California girls were unforgettable. Fizzy V1L says, Daisy Dukes. Champion F9Y says, are you talking to me gang? Quem official says, yeah. Fizzy V1L says, tongue sticking out. Quem official says, of course. Quem official says, you're the only one that has insulted anyone here. Quem official says, who else would I be talking to? Fresty2 says, what happened? Fizzy V1L says, air. Quem official says, Champion called me a 5 years old. Fresty2 says, goop. Fizzy V1L says, I don't know Fresty II. Quem official says, Idric though. Quem official says, he can think what he thinks. Quem official says, 2. Quem official says, 4. Quem official says, VO. Quem official says, 6. Quem official says, 7. Quem official says, 9. Fizzy V1L says, by the way love your PFP at Fresty II. Quem official says, 1 2 3 4 5. Quem official says, CI. Fresty2 says, thank you Fizzy. The character's my OC named Fresty. Quem official says, CII. Quem official says, CII. Champion F9Y says, why is it skipping me gang? Fizzy V1L says, oh well you're saying my OC right now, smiley face, but also it's no problem. Quem official says, cause you ain't talking. Champion F9Y says, yes I am. Noodlesup says, ah poop. Quem official says, ALR. Fizzy V1L says, and probably it has favorites. Quem official says, but earlier you weren't talking that much. Quem official says, that's probably why. Fresty2 says, I'm an unknown breed, unsprouted seed, a hot spring frozen over by your cold mentality. 3, Hansel Sodikin. Champion F9Y says, bro shut up. Quem official says, what did I do? Fizzy V1L says, it's so violent. Fizzy V1L says, sigh. Quem official says, Deutsch ist ein sehr schön Sprache. We get es Alan Hoot. Fresty2 says, what's violent? The chat. Quem official says, yeah. Quem official says, yeah. Quem official says, oh yeah. Quem official says, these kids bro. Quem official says, Gen Alpha brain-rotted kids. Fizzy V1L says, for real though. Minjascat says, Hisupomo Shupio. Quem official says, y'all could never be as cool as Gen Z. Champion F9Y says, it skipped me again gang. Quem official says, like me. Quem official says, oh yeah it did. Quem official says, odd. Quem official says, oh. Champion F9Y says, bro. Quem official says, it's because you said a bad word. Fizzy V1L says, I'll never get up to your level. Champion F9Y says, whatever bro. Noah on pause Thurian says, I'm a Thurian and autistic. Noodlesup says, evil. Quem official says, Noah. Fizzy V1L says, evil. Minjascat says, don't need to fight over generation, people can't control when they are born. Quem official says, or like. Quem official says, Who said we were fighting over generation laughing out loud? Noah on pause 3 and says, ye ah. Fizzy V1L says, I just heard, My Little Pony, from the living room. Noah on pause 3 and says, Quem. Minjascat says, y'all could never be cool as Gen Z. Minjascat says, Quem. Quem official says, it's fighting if two people join the argument. Quem official says, you are the one fighting about it here. Fizzy V1L says, no way my sister is watching My Little Pony. Fizzy V1L says, Pony. Quem official says, I left that topic a while ago. Minjascat says, why did you still say that though? Quem official says, what's wrong with saying that? Bin Iamangasa says, I'm in love with someone. Quem official says, I think I hear a mic in the background. Wachampion F9Y says, at Thatchikanuddlesoup is the biggest cornball and biggest 6'7" kid I already know it. He prob reading this saying to himself, how did he know? Noah on pause 3 and says, any Therians, other pause, or supporters here? Willow's Art says, it's C. Quem official says, who bin I am? Quem official says, laughing my ass off. Fizzy V1L says, I'm a supporter, laughing face. Noah on pause 3 and says, yay, Fizzy is a Therian supporter. ITSVYAH Skaming says, it's that one. Homer Horn says, heheha. Quem official says, Wachampion hating on someone who commented once. Quem official says, crazy. Wachampion F9Y says, facts. Quem official says, why are we advertising ourselves here? Willow's Art says, yes, I'm a Therian myself. Bin Iamangasa says, someone I knew here. Wachampion F9Y says, he said the S word for no reason. Shit Smear says, it's the skeleton. Quem official says, laughing my ass off. ITSVOYAH Skaming says, the female skeleton is that one right there. Quem official says, bro's name is shit_smasher. Homer Horn says, it's C. Quem official says, smear asterisk. Noah on pause 3 and says, yay. Willows is a Therian. Fizzy V1L says, my friend is also a Therian and I used to be but I left the like 2 years ago. Fizzy V1L says, I think. Stryabai says, me. Quem official says, laughing my freaking ass off. Fresty2 says, the oldest Gen Alpha can be up to 14 to 16 I think, this prob is outdated cause I had to get on a call with my mom. FizzyV1L says, wait never mind I have pause in my cloy. Quem official says, shit underscore smear your name is awesome. Team Reckless G5T says, what the fudge? Nissan Boy Gaming says, said hi. Champion F9Y says, ye that one right there tells us a lot bud. Quem official says, yeah but Gen Alpha started in 2013. Fresty2 says, I'm an ultra-human prob and other paw tongue sticking out. ITSVOYAH Skaming says, it's that skeleton over there. Quem official says, Gen Z ended in 2013. Willow's Art says, I like that this thing can say MF. Champion F9Y says, ye the girl is that one. Fresty2 says, some PPL think it started in 2010 to 2012 depending on who you ask. Quem official says, y'all why are you guys becoming Therians and stuff just be happy with yourself quit changing your settings. Noah on pause Therian says, wait, you can't stop being a Therian. Riley B Unicorn 5 says, a mick. Quem official says, yeah it varies Fresty. ITSVOYAH Skaming says, yo what the heck like why are we talking about the rains? ITSVOYAH Skaming says, asterisk Therians. Fresty2 says, well you can't, as therianthropy is involuntary. Noah on pause Therian says, you haven't become or quit being a Therian. FizzyV1L says, I don't know. Quem official says, oh screw you Nightbot. Lena likes lemons 18 says, see, because it has wider hips. Nissan Boy Gaming says, 67. Shashavone says, said hi. ITSVOYAH Gaming says, do YALL believe in spawnism? CRZ Crystal says, it's C, women have wider pelvises to be able to deliver babies easier. Quem official says, WWE please hate on Nissan Boy Gaming. FizzyV1L says, I don't. ITSVOYAH Gaming says, I hate spawnism. FizzyV1L says, goop. Fresty2 says, no, that's harmful, via tongue sticking out. Quem official says, what y'all think of the flying spaghetti monster? Shit Smear says, I goon to 2-time. Quem official says, it's an actual religion. ITSVYAH Skaming says, bro. Fresty2 says, spawnism is harmful. Quem Official says, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Quem Official says, look it up. ITSVYAH Skaming says, no hate, but is spawnism demonic if you are a Christian? Quem Official says, I don't know. FizzyV1L says, oh no, I'm not going to that church. Quem Official says, what is spawnism? Quem Official says, laughing my ass off. Shit Smear says, a Roblox religion. Quem Official says, bruh. Quem Official says, why we advertising Forsaken here? ITSVYAH Skaming says, I don't know, I just see videos that say that spawnism is cringe and weird. Quem Official says, yeah. FizzyV1L says, no, even Roblox has a religion that's crazy. Quem Official says, it is. ITSVYAH Skaming says, no, people be making religions out of anything now. Fresty2 says, spawnism involves harming others and yourselves and sometimes going to the point of killing others and yourselves. It is a Roblox religion, but some PPL decided to be stupid. Quem Official says, religion. FizzyV1L says, real though. Willow's Art says, bro is mad that he can't be a Thurian laughing out loud. ITSVYAH Skaming says, what? Quem Official says, who? ITSVYAH Skaming says, we not talking bout dat no more. Quem Official says, yesh. Quem Official says, that stuff got left behind a while ago. FizzyV1L says, yeah, we moved on. ITSVYAH Skaming says, YH. Fresty2 says, my mom's getting me and my sister McDonald's. Quem Official says, I JS bleached my hair. Quem Official says, lucky. Quem Official says, get me some too. Fresty2 says, also the narrator is so behind. Fresty2 says, goop. ITSVYAH Skaming says, now. FizzyV1L says, my cat keeps getting in my face blocking my view from my phone. ITSVYAH Skaming says, she was carrying the whole convo. Fresty2 says, they got kidnapped, dash. ITSVYAH Skaming says, I got my hair dyed a color like gingerish brownish. Fresty2 says, cutesy. Bree Ian says, W spawnism. Fresty2 says, what? ITSVYAH Skaming says, Byaro. Fizzy V1L says, my cat said hi y'all, he is pawing my screen, by the way his man is J.P. ITSVYAH Skaming says, we moved on. Kelly Overend says, I'm just a small bean. Next Gaming says, no. Wachampion F9Y says, anyone else I need to hate on? Bree Ian says, me. Wachampion F9Y says, your cat is a fat ah. Fizzy V1L says, hate on me I wanna see. Wachampion F9Y says, okay. STR4B3 RRYL0V3 Artificia says, said hi. Bree Ian says, your username is the username of a 9-year-old. Fizzy V1L says, thanks for telling me. Leslie Ruiz S2T says, hi. Bree Ian says, not you. Fizzy V1L says, oh. Fresty2 says, I disappeared for a bit. Noah on pause Thurian says, I'm a Thurian and my stereotype are red wolf, grey wolf, and grey tabby cat. Sierra Cathal says, is it C? Nairo Shahediaraki says, oh my god what is this fa? Fizzy V1L says, fox. Noah on pause Thurian says, cool, a fox Thurian. Tayfan says, they're all the same laughing out loud. Fresty2 says, I'm an other paw I think tongue sticking out. Fizzy V1L says, oh nice. Fresty2 says, or other link I don't know.
IVIX subscribed.
Sam IS4J says, it's C. Fizzy V1L says, there's so many name I can't even keep up. Noah on pause Thurian says, other linkers are cool, smiley face. Noah on pause Thurian says, and valid. Thekras Irascal says, this is too confusing. Feathered Crane says, the female skeleton differs from the male primarily in its wider and lower pelvis, for childbearing, smaller size, smoother bone surfaces, and narrower ribcage. Answer C. Noah on pause 3 says, any autistic people. Evelyn Rise says, I don't know. Champion F9Y says, at Brilliance made his name off something he is not, so you go to your MoMA for help, get friends that also say 6-7 all day, I give up in life. Noah on pause 3 says, any peeps with autism. Fresty2 says, I hate my chest so much, tongue sticking out. Landon Fisher says, hey. Bot says, welcome to chat at Landon_Fisher, welcome. Fizzy V1L says, why you hate your chest? Champion F9Y says, for real though. Fresty2 says, because it's uncomfortable and I don't like it and I'm not even going to use them ever, so WHYY, I'm female. Noah on pause 3 says, I hate my chest because I'm a trans boy and have dysphoria about my BREASTD. Fizzy V1L says, oh, I get it now. Champion F9Y says, the hell. Evelyn Rise says, I think it's C, I don't know. Fizzy V1L says, I understand your pain. Evelyn Rise says, this is so hard. Inolieno says, how am I supposed to see which one is a woman, face purple crying, face purple crying. Champion F9Y says, at Fresty what you use then to get guys? Evelyn Rise says, you give hard questions. Noah on pause 3 says, I'm trans, autistic, and Athurian, smiley face. Fresty2 says, I don't like men laughing out loud. Rude Bitch says, C or A. Fizzy V1L says, oh, that's a lot. Landon Fisher says, I doubt we needed to know that, Noah. Fizzy V1L says, me either, laughing out loud. Evelyn Rise says, wait, I think it's C because the chest looks a little small. Rude Bitch says, help with. Noah on pause 3 says, I wanted to find a community. Landon Fisher. Champion F9Y says, the hell is this chat, am I the only normal one here that like the opposite gender? Fresty2 says, I think everyone's normal, laughing face. Fizzy V1L says, wait, I didn't mean to say, laughing out loud, darn autocorrect. Landon Fisher says, I don't think this is the one you're looking for, Noah. Wendy Wong I4Z says, said hi. Landon Fisher says, but do what you want. Fresty2 says, I'm community, 3. Rude Bitch says, I'm normal the hell. Wendy Wong I4Z says, B or C. Islamic Kennel says, I'm straight too. Wachampion F9Y says, no, it not normal to be les or guy gang. Fizzy V1L says, then shut up. Evelyn Rise says, shut up Meg. Ronnie says, see the hips are wider. Fizzy V1L says, if you don't like it keep it to yourself, N1 gives a damn. Polar Sun says, said hi. Landon Fisher says, I bet it's C. Fresty2 says, it's normal to love who you love or not love anyone, laughing face. Noah on pause Therian says, everyone should be normal as long as they aren't hurting themselves or anybody else. Like Therians. Evelyn Rise says, I do hove damn. Rowan Genshigo 56 says, I think it's B. Evelyn Rise says, is it way or way? Lily Mercer says, laughing my ass off, studied forensic anthro, it's C. Evelyn Rise says, is it way or way? Wachampion F9Y says, gang have fun in hell, I'm going to Havian. Fresty2 says, way, it's spelled way. Fizzy V1L says, KK. Fizzy V1L says, I honestly don't like that rule. Fizzy V1L says, it's unfair. Fresty2 says, why would God punish us for loving who we love when He's the one that made us, and if He doesn't make mistakes, how is being LGBTQ plus a mistake? Landon Fisher says, geez, don't bring religion into this fucked up coagulation of a conversation. Wachampion F9Y says, bro, you cannot have babies with same gender. Avagmer says, I think it's 6 or 7 mango fonk. Wachampion F9Y says, it far. Fizzy V1L says, so you think we don't know that? Fresty2 says, Babies suck and are expensive and God wouldn't expect us to make children when he knows we don't wanna, dash. Noah on pause 3 says, I don't want babies anyway, and it's stupid to believe making babies are the point of life in all its beauty. Fizzy V1L says, if you think it's fair then cool for you but I honestly don't give a damn. Joaquinita Ramos says, Ninguno de los tres. Avagmer says, Diddy Kaka Adolf. Fresty2 says, yeah, believing that making babies are the point of life is stupid. Fizzy V1L says, real though. Landon Fisher says, who said making babies are the point in life? Fresty2 says, you're not funny Avagmer. Noah on pause 3 says, it's the fish hat again, smiley face, meme. Fresty2 says, I'm just agreeing with what Noah said laughing out loud. Carnival Apparel says, what is that laughing out loud? One MC0OLR1GHT says, America Australia India ACA Papua Aha China Kong Phi Fa Chai Malaysia Yupan Ipin Selamat Pajai Sikguk, 5 Yari Kedik 3 Telfan Pakar Gak Ada Pulsa Minta Opa Minta AMA, Appa Gangnam Style. Eisen Animates Katriak says, Barack Obama. Fizzy V1L says, what is this language? Landon Fisher says, why are you guys talking about this type stuff under a random YouTube short live? This seems very random. Carnival Apparel says, I don't know. Eisen Animates Katriak says, Joe Biden. Fresty2 says, because we have something called free will. Fizzy V1L says, okay it's YouTube what do you expect you will find some fucked up people. Pratham says, hello. Fresty2 says, and it's not even bad laughing out loud. Noah on pause 3 says, it's the fish hat again, smiley face, meme. Eisen Animates Katriak says, Donald Trump. July Video says, hi I just watched this live short. Wachampion F9Y says, people who like the opposite gender, I honestly just find stupid and you guys can hate on me all you want, but when you guys try to argue against it, you guys don't even know it, but you just make no s. Yadiel Morales G1L says, the one in the right. Eisen Animates Katriak says, touch and hold a clip to pin it. Unpinned clips will be deleted after 1 hour. Landon Fisher says, I'm just saying it's random, you wouldn't exactly talk about politics in a chat about chess. Wachampion F9Y says, I meant same gender. Landon Fisher says, asterisk stream about chess. Fresty2 says, you just called heterosexual PPL stupid laughing out loud. Peter Sassy says, it see larger hip smaller shoulders. Carnival Apparel says, what is this brew? I don't think anyone is women. Eisen Animates Catriac says, it's fucking Socrates. Shit Smear says, me to Lois. July Video says, 6677770 a Merry Riz Mass. Wachampion F9Y says, people who like the same gender ours are stupid and you guys can hate on me, all you want and you guys don't even know it, but you guys make 0 sense 20 argue against it. Eisen Animates Catriac says, does a skeleton control your body or your body controls the skeleton? You calm yourself from drowning the old man in the sea. One MC0OLR1GHT says, our soul control all of it. Yadiel Morales G1L says, which one is it me, I don't know Biaro. One MC0OLR1GHT says, just ask the skeleton. Yadiel Morales G1L says, fa. Fizzy V1L says, your mind controls you, you don't control it. Noah on pause there and says, hi. Any candy kids Kate? Eisen Animates Catriac says, does our soul control the body or the body controls the soul? You throw a rock at the old man, Socrates leaves like a good boy. Shit Smear says, I think it's that one. July Video says, people who is writing gibberish so the audio say you are comment. July Video says, Sue Relapple. One MC0OLR1GHT says, our soul control brought all of the body. Eisen Animates Catriac says, if commenting is your power, what are dash? You cut him off, you had enough of this bum, you tie good boy Socrates in a rowboat so he could go back to Greece. One MC0OLR1GHT says, what the fudge are you talking ABT? Noah on pause there says, I'm happy that life is finally nice for me. I've had so much hate from classmates from being that otherian, so I'm finally on spring break. Shit Smear says, LARPing is the key to life. Wachampion F9Y says, July Video is such a Cornwall he's probably saying 6-7 self right now, while switching from this stream to skip the toilet. Cutie Corona says, you are strong, because I am you, or are you the one who left it all behind, and his overwhelming intensity, because, with this treasure I summon. Bretta Smilov says, Bretta Smilov says, said hi. Eisen Animates Katriak says, curse energy is negative energy, but it can't be regenerated. Instead, you multiply that negative energy against itself to create positive energy. That's the reverse curse technique. Daniel Z8W says, poop. Noah on pause 3 says, I love LARPing. Wind Production Channel says, hi bro. Wind Production Channel says, hi dude. Wind Production Channel says, hi dude. Eisen Animates Katriak says, I heard people talking. Noah on pause 3 says, I'm a Thurian and trans, smiley face. Muhammad Fawad Mustafa says, hello C. Eisen Animates Katriak says, you are my special. Eisen Animates Katriak says, you are my special. Noah on pause 3 says, I used to be les until I transitioned to male. Shit Smear says, good for you man. Wachampion F9Y says, the hell. User 1234C3Q says, is B the woman? Noah on pause 3 says, we champion somebody asked. Daniel Z8W says, rest in peace my granny, she got hit by a bazooka. Yeah, I think about her every time I hit the hookah. Kaboom kablo. I was in my room trying to teach my little sister.